This is the story of Laura Matilda Towne, an abolitionist who volunteered to help bring freedom to Southern slaves during the Civil War. Towne left a diary of her volunteer experiences, and her account reveals a belief in total economic independence for African freedmen that was unique and bold, making her story highly valuable for those who want to gain a better understanding of Northern attitudes toward emancipation. Towne was born on May 3, 1825, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After her mother died when she was young, her family moved to Philadelphia, where she was introduced to the anti-slavery movement. As a young woman, at the same time that she was becoming a radical abolitionist, Towne also studied to become a doctor at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. When the Civil War broke out, she became actively involved in the Union effort to end slavery. The primary way that she did this was by volunteering for the Port Royal Experiment. The Port Royal Experiment was designed for the Sea Islands, which were located off the coast of South Carolina and, during the time of the Civil War, were known for producing cotton. The largest of the Sea Islands was Port Royal, which is why the experiment was named after it. The experiment began with the Union capture of the area in November 1861. All the whites fled the islands, leaving the Union government in possession of highly lucrative cotton plantations and approximately 8,000 slaves. Union officials recognized an opportunity to gain a profit from the plantations. To do this, however, they would need to retain the black labor, but they did not feel comfortable keeping the Africans on as slaves. In February of 1862, the government decided to compromise by emancipating the blacks and then hiring them to serve as field hands. Each plantation was given a white supervisor who was instructed to teach the emancipated blacks how to work as freedmen. The government also felt that the blacks should be taught to be as self-reliant as possible and decided to allow the freedmen to purchase their own land for private cultivation. In order to help them adjust to this new capitalist system, the government asked benevolent abolitionist societies in the North to send teachers, ministers, doctors, and other volunteers to the Sea Islands. Towne eagerly responded to this call, and in April of 1862 she was sent to the Sea Islands under the sponsorship of the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Aid Association. She was initially appointed the community doctor for Port Royal. A few months later, Towne was asked to teach in one of the schools for black children, a post she particularly enjoyed. In 1863, Towne opened her own school, called the Penn School, and in 1865, Towne was appointed superintendent of all the schools operated by the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Aid Association on the South Carolina coast. While Towne's description of her time as a volunteer sheds a great deal of light on many of the issues involved in Northern emancipation efforts in the South during the Civil War, one of the most interesting things it shows is how whites were often divided over two different economic agendas for the black community. Towne represents the first agenda, which was committed to total emancipation and economic independence for African Americans. From the beginning, Towne was clear that her reason for volunteering was to, quote, strengthen the anti-slavery element. She was first and foremost an abolitionist, and she desired to be, quote, confident and freely daring in supporting total emancipation, unquote. For her, this meant doing everything she could to help the freedmen become economically independent. For example, she talks about how she encouraged black entrepreneurship at every opportunity, stating that she once told a black man that although the law did not compel him to work for the government, quote, he had better do it for the sake of the wages, but on no account to delay planting cotton on his own land too, for it would be profitable, unquote. Towne was especially adamant that the blacks should be allowed to purchase and cultivate their own land, believing that this would enable them to achieve economic autonomy and therefore true freedom. She stated, "It is to be hoped that every family will have its own land and find work enough on that." Consequently, she was overjoyed when the government decided to allow blacks to purchase private farms on the Sea Islands in early 1863. She also eagerly followed the freedmen's progress in cultivating both the government's cotton crop and their own personal subsistence crops, such as corn. In the first year of the experiment, the black community planted nearly 15,000 acres of cotton, corn, potatoes, and grain. Towne was delighted by this achievement, writing, It is such a satisfaction to an abolitionist to see that they are proving conclusively that they can and will and even like to work enough at least to support themselves and give something extra to government. Unfortunately, Towne states that most of the other volunteers had a different agenda for the emancipated slaves, one that adhered to a more moderate emancipation and the continued economic independence of blacks on whites. Almost immediately, Towne noticed that most of her fellow instructors did not appear to have the same abolitionist motivations for volunteering. She wrote in exasperation, "I think a rather too cautious spirit prevails. Anti-slavery is to be kept in the background for fear of exciting animosity." She asserted that initially the other volunteers did not adequately explain emancipation to the slaves, leading blacks to, quote, "suppose that if they do not do so-and-so, they may be returned to their masters. Volunteers keep in the background the benevolence of their plans or the justice of them." Specifically, Towne described her fellow volunteers as being so consumed with cotton cultivation that they tried to prevent the blacks from working their own land and forced them to spend all their time caring for the cotton to generate government profits. In Towne's view, such an abuse of power maintained old hierarchies of oppressive white dominance and kept the blacks from becoming economically self-sufficient. Towne was also incensed by the way the supervisors approached the issue of black land ownership. Union officials allowed both emancipated slaves and white speculators to bid on the same property, and since the Africans had no savings and their wages were inconsistent, they were usually unable to outbid whites for land. Towne viewed this as a gross injustice that kept blacks economically dependent on whites for employment. She also anticipated that this measure would heighten racial animosity on the islands and ultimately lead to the failure of the experiment. She wrote of her fear that the volunteers would lose their reputation as, quote, "enthusiasts, abolitionists, and philanthropists, and instead become known as cotton agents, Negro drivers, and oppressors." Clearly, Towne's views on the economic implications of emancipation were markedly different from those of her fellow volunteers. For Towne, true emancipation would enable blacks to become economically equal to whites by giving them access to land and reliable wages. In contrast, she felt that the other volunteers held to a diluted version of emancipation that maintained old economic hierarchies by attempting to control the freedmen's labor and land. Ultimately, Towne's account demonstrates just how strong racial prejudice was in the 19th century, even among groups normally considered to be fully committed to the concept of equality, like abolitionists. As her time as a volunteer showed, freedom is a difficult concept to define, and it often causes division among the very people that claim to promote it. By taking the radical view of emancipation, however, Towne helped to show her fellow volunteers what abolitionism should truly encompass. She had the courage to proclaim her convictions, and although during her life she stood out from the crowd because of this, she left an example for future generations of activists to follow. Although it would take almost 100 years before civil rights for blacks was fully realized, Towne helped to define and support the process of emancipation in the South that would ultimately lead to independence for all African Americans. Through her service in the Port Royal experiment, Towne demonstrated that full freedom is worth fighting for.